What was your high school's tragedy? The woodwork teacher ran a running club after school. One day he and the students were running on a footpath on school property and a car veered off the road and hit him and a student. He died instantly. The student had a broken femur. It was witnessed by 20+ students and apparently the screams were traumatizing. The next day at school was a surreal experience. R.I.P. Mr. M. There was a real nice guy, Eagle Scout I think. Friendly and a good student. His friend, someone he trusted, crept into his house one night undetected, walked upstairs, murdered the guy's parents in their sleep with a knife, and then murdered him after a struggle. The sister heard noise and was able to flee to a neighbor and call 911. PA state troopers went on a manhunt with bloodhounds. The dude's dad eventually turned him after he had confessed. The sister was the sole surviving family member. The only motive the police could find was something the murderer wrote, that he hated happy people. The whole thing was dug up. Still is. The murderer ended up killing himself in prison a year or two ago after multiple state Supreme Court rulings denied his petition to reduce like 3 life sentences he was serving. Had a guy in my year punched from another guy in our school. He fell back and hit his head on the gutter and went into cardiac arrest and died later on in hospital. That's my biggest fear when in a physical fight. Bright, very nice young man, 16 years old, was driving to the hospital to meet his sister's new baby when he was struck and killed by a drunk driver. The atmosphere of the entire school changed that week. Poor kid. I can't imagine how the sister must have felt, going from one of the happiest days of her life to learning her brother died. A pretty popular girl at my school parents were separated. During spring break, her and her dad went on a trip together. Her dad shot her after the trip was over and drove with her body to a property of his where he then killed himself. One of the girl's best friends was in my English class and was the one who informed the school of the killing. Jesus Christ, why would a parent do that? Edit. I ducking hate that my top 3 comments are all about family problems, but I'm somewhat happy it isn't my family. I went to a school in a small town. We had 112 kids from K-12, so for the most part everyone was close and knew everybody. On the way to a basketball game, a 16-year-old student was killed when a semi hit black ice and hit her little car head on. Her parents were in the vehicle behind her and saw it happen right in front of them. The truck driver was overcome with guilt and eventually committed suicide. Tragic all around. While hanging out with friends, a student decided to show off and lay flat on some train tracks and let the train pass right over him. Obviously it didn't end well. What I heard was that something hooked his jaw and ripped his head off. All of this was less than a month after a different student committed suicide. My friend suffered from a cardiac arrest in the pool and died 2 weeks later. Our school had a beloved teacher in our foreign language department. She was like a second mother to many students and was a good friend of my family. My sister has a learning disability and was taking her class at the time. The teacher was very understanding and did everything she could to help my sister do well, even outside of her class. Her husband was a coach and their kids were of course going to our school, so their family was well known and well liked in the community. They were all involved in a serious car crash. Someone tried to pass a large truck and failed to check for oncoming traffic. Their car was hit head on. The teacher and her husband were killed. One of their 2 kids ended up in the ICU for a long time. The other had minor to moderate injuries. The people in the other car were killed. Our school and community were devastated. My sister developed driving anxiety due to the incident and couldn't get her driver's license until she was 21. Such an awful thing. My school was private and pretty small, and in the early 90s we did educational camping trips, and parents would volunteer to drive as a caravan out to a national park. One parent had their own child and several others in their van. When they veered off the road just a little bit, they overcorrected, and the van flipped. Their own son died in the wreck, and his best friend had both legs broke. The parent driving was fine physically, but definitely wished they could have traded their own life to get their sons back. We had a dude that murdered his GF and put her in his trunk. He drove that car to school for a couple days while she was missing until they finally found her. Edit. Well, this blew up. If anyone is interested, I found link from the court case of some of the kids that turned him in. It gives all the details of this morbid story. http case law find law.com/KS Supreme Court /1,374,172 HTML. I have a similar story. My best friend's sister was shot and killed by her boyfriend. My best friend was not taking it well and hung himself in his front yard, and they couldn't get him back. He was my neighbor to add into it. Edit. Couldn't get him back translation. Couldn't resuscitate him or avert him from a coma state. Sorry, I wrote this in a little bit of a rush and figured people would be able to work it out. FCK. Those poor parents. Can you imagine being in their shoes when it happened? That sheet really cuts deep. About 6 years ago, a girl and a few of her friends were heading to our town's festival in the evening, like 8-ish. When they were walking in front of the school, a car came speeding down the road and hit them. One girl died in front of the school, and they never found out who did it. Another, although I believe she was in middle school, but it happened on the same street. It was New Year's Eve, late at night, and a group of kids were crossing the street. One of them dropped their phone on the crosswalk. One of the girls ran back onto the road to get her friend's phone when she got hit by a van and died. The fact that they never caught the person who hit the first girl really pisses me off. We had a student die each year of high school. Each one's name started with J. Science teacher set himself on fire in the parking lot, left behind a wife and kid. One of his students killed herself from jumping in front of a train not long after. I feel like she got the idea from him. God, I cannot even understand why someone would light themselves on fire. It's said to be the worst way to go, as it's very painful and takes a while for you to die. Some people feel like they deserve the pain and do that intentionally. They feel they have a debt to the world they can only pay in pain and death. A girl was murdered. They did an episode on Snapped about her. It was super sad. BC, she went missing. Was a super popular senior. Her sister was in my class and I knew of her. We all wore ribbons and spread posters around. After a few months her body was SE. Literally in the weird area BTWR track field and the building she walked to for vocational training. A family friend ambushed her and stabbed her, burying her in a shallow grave, where snow eventually hit her until our first thaw. It was a few years after that DNA confirmed who the killer was. I went to a Votech school and chose culinary for my shop. Close to the end of my freshman year, we found out that our chef's assistant was going through a brutal divorce. We found this out because one Friday evening, she went home and was killed by her husband in a murder-suicide. The school ended up naming the cafeteria after her, which was a thoughtful tribute. I read that as she went home and killed her husband instead of being the victim, which made the cafeteria tribute really confusing for a second. Arguably the most popular teacher in our school, for his boundless love of his students and incredible mentorship, committed suicide the year after I graduated. We found out he had been struggling with drug addiction and depression for most of his life, which blew us all away. I'm well acquainted with the deceptions of depression now, but at the time it rocked my very foundation. This was the teacher who had students flocking to his classroom almost every lunch break, just to hang out with him, because he was so awesome and caring. We'd rather be there than at ducking Quiznos or wherever. He played card games with us, discussed literature/film, we all shared stories. He would play guitar and jam out with other student musicians. He brought me flowers when I was leading a school play once. I'll always be heartbroken over the world's loss of this wonderful man. 2 kids were hanging out at this dude's house. There was a pump-action shotgun there. The one kid kept loading it and pumping the shells out. The kid with the gun put it up to the other kid's head, who happened to be on the phone with his girlfriend, and pulled the trigger thinking it was unloaded. It was not unloaded. Rule 1. Every gun is always loaded. Rule 2. Never aim a gun at an object you do not wish it to destroy, nor a living being you do not wish it to kill. Rule 3. Be aware of your target and what is behind it. What is behind it? This is important. I wish I saw this said more often. We had a very nice kid stabbed in the abdomen for wearing blue in a blood neighborhood. He wasn't a gang member, just someone wearing the wrong color. The knife hit his appendix, which was already infected, and it burst. He survived, and, honestly, I think he became motivated by the whole thing. Still scary and sad though.